Okay. Right, we're recording.
Great.
Do you want to start by, not for obvious historical purposes, the goal of Sprint 1?
Yeah, I think I might want to start with welcome to the sprint review for the first sprint of the Comet work cycle. Comet Comet is scoped as a staff-facing digital object management system. And this is, I think, our first chance to see some of what that might mean in practical terms. So that's, I hope that people will be watching this and be providing feedback about what they see. The goal of the sprint, to answer your question, Gabriella, was really for the team to be able to stand up a working application that we can deposit objects to. There's an enormous backlog of work requirements that we've extracted from the stakeholder requirements process. And Gabriella and I have worked extensively to get all of that organized. But our immediate goal for this first 2-week cycle was to get ourselves a working development environment, to be able to deploy to a production-like system, and for it to be possible to do the basic task of logging in and creating an object without any sort of overhead requirements to that. So that what you're going to see in the demo is a really simple deposit. And I think I might be prepared to diverge a little bit into what's next and what's likely. I think a lot of the basics of what we'll see in the demo are subject to change very rapidly in the next sprint or two. So I think what you should be paying attention to is just the bones here. Does that make sense, Gabriella? Am I being articulate enough?
Yeah, and so I think that, in summary, that we will measure success by seeing that it is possible to save content without seeing any errors on Comet's end. Okay.
I think that's right. Yeah. From my perspective, I'll say just before we bump over to the demo, this was a really successful sprint. And we did actually, I think, succeed at the goal that we set. We had a retrospective yesterday. This demo is being recorded a day late, just because we actually had quite a bit of technical trouble getting the deployment done for yesterday's scheduled demo. So that puts us maybe a day behind, but we also did actually wrap up the work on the sprint timeline. So that's exciting too. And I think importantly, the team was really productive. Some of the choices that we made about how to approach this work were sort of go for broke in nature. So by that, I mean, we sort of did the hard thing to do it right at the outset, rather than the cheap and easy thing to check the boxes off. And I think that really actually paid off. And we've set some goals that are sort of team facing for the next sprint that I'll again come back to. Okay, so here we go, Comet. So this is a sort of default. Oh, and my Zoom is probably blocking important parts of the UI here. This is a default Hyraxy landing page. I think we'll probably redirect this somewhere else. Some of the features that we get out of the box with Hyrax are self-deposit focused. So the really obvious thing here is this big share your work button. And I think very quickly this won't exist. But I'm going to go ahead and move us through login. The login is currently database backed for this system. It's a goal for the next sprint to wire it into SSO with Google Auth. I think we'll hopefully by this time 2 weeks out, we'll be demoing this with a Google Auth login. But for now, I have a user that I've created in the Comet admin, not an example. I'm always doing example.cometlibrary.ucsb.edu. When we deploy our test applications, we're sort of seeding this user and the related UCSD user, just change one letter, as admins out of the box for testing purposes. So password. And I can reveal the big secret that the password is admin password. Okay, so we have a dashboard. Again, probably a lot of what's in here is subject to change. But you can see that since I deployed this application about 10 minutes ago, one user has signed up. One object has been published. There are object states here. So if this like little bar here would change if some of the objects were in process in some way. This graph doesn't seem to be, maybe tomorrow it will update to show objects equals 1. But I think that this graph would function if we had a longer lived application. So there's a lot of stuff in the sidebar here. Most of it I expect not actually to be working for us just yet, because we're like our next step is sort of to power through. Our next step is to sort of power through what's working and what's not, and what of the existing requirements we can check off from just having deployed the application versus what needs rework or tweaking or better support. So I'm going to go to works, which is a little dashboard of the works that I own. Ownership is a concept which, Gabriella, you and I should probably talk about and determine what it means for Comet's purposes, or whether it's a concept that we should sort of scrub from the application. And there's an add new work button up here, so I'm going to do that. The work terminology is also subject to change. Oh, and if I click it properly, then it does actually work. What should we name it, Gabriella? What's the title of this work? This is, by the way, a config generated form, and part of the reason that it's only has title is that we've scrubbed all the metadata config out so that we can replace it with configurable metadata coming from the end users. But for now, there's a title, and we should give it one.
I think to honor Thor, we should give it the title, It's Alive.
It's alive. I love it. You can see that there's little like details about the field. So title is required. That's metadata configuration determining that that's required. I think there, in the case of title, it's actually just sort of hard-coded application required, which is another conversation, I think. And I can add files. And I'm just gonna like grab a PDF. Look, that I was in St. Louis at some point before the pandemic. So
We're trying to get there.
What's that?
I said, or you were trying to get there.
Well, no, I was actually, because Samvera Connect was in St. Louis.
Oh.
The year, I guess the fall before COVID.
Okay.
And I'm going to leave it public. This deposit agreement, I do have to check. There's a feature flag for squashing this deposit agreement, both the display of the agreement itself and the active requirement to check it. I assume, Gabriella, that we'll want to just go ahead and squash this checkbox altogether. And there's some basic visibility settings. Surfliner is the name of the institution that's configured. So that in self-deposit mode, this would be like access restricted to UCSB or access restricted to UCSD, as the case may be. But I think that this is also like everything between these two things, between private and public, is sort of up in the air. And I'm going to keep it private because I'm half suspicious that setting it public won't actually work at the moment. And we do have open issues for making the ACLs really functional and in line with user requirements. So let's do the save button. You can see there's a drag and drop area, which I think also works. I don't have a desktop that has things I can drag and drop in, but maybe it'd be worth doing. Like, let's do. Well, now I'm like complicating things quite a bit, aren't I? Well, that's what I get for trying to show features that I haven't tested in this deploy. Okay, so I'm going to do save. And we have an object. It says it's processing things in the background. And that's true. I'm not exactly sure that it's going to succeed at processing those things. But there we go. And you can see some things in the UI here as well that are interesting. So there's add to collection and attach child, which I think we probably want to replace this terminology with component. Is that accurate, do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Just all the parent child stuff is component. Well, I don't know what the inverse of a component is. And generic object is also, I think, terminology that will change. I think this will probably very soon just say object.
Object.
But it turns out that naming things object in an object-oriented language is troubling because object is a very, very, very reserved keyword. So this is all just internationalization config change to have here. That's it. I'm sort of reluctant to click around to much else, except I can probably do that. Yeah, that's good. So we are actually indexing these objects and the metadata is going into the index. You can see that I own it as Comet admin. And maybe we'll go back to the dashboard just to be, now we've got 2 published objects, still just 1 user. I go to works and I've got 2. Not bad.
So just a question, only because I'm not familiar with this UI. Would we ever see a thumbnail to the left of the title there in this view?
Absolutely. I think
Okay.
that is very much the normal, what we'd expect to happen once we have ironed out all the details. So one thing about this upload process is that I'm just gonna like back it way up and go. I'm gonna go in through share your work this time. So we'll add a file here. Oh, the previous folder upload didn't work for the obvious reason that there was no content in that folder. Let's do add file this time. Okay, so here's baginfo.txt. This is just a random text file that I've deposited. So what's happened here is that the uploader has pushed this file into a staging area on the web server. And not until I push this submit button does it get saved to the repository storage. So you can see when it says your files are being processed in the background, that means that it's doing all the work of pushing those staged files into the repository storage. And one of the technical decisions that's being ironed out is what exactly that repository storage will be. I can reveal that the interface is the interface for Amazon's S3 object storage. So I think for UCSB, it's actually likely that we will store them in AWS via S3. And we're deploying for these test applications as well as for production for UCSD, a S3 compatible object storage that's backed by local disks. The platform's called Minio, and what that means is that we can use the S3 API as really just an API. Where we choose to store the repository content is something that we can make sort of on the fly decisions about. So we think it's a very neat architecture. But what that means is that that's work for the upcoming sprint. So none of the many things that should happen once this object goes into the repository storage are yet happening. So that would look like this content here should get populated. Automated file characterization happens with the FITS software out of Harvard. So a FITS XML file gets created that shows the current file characterization info, and then derivatives get generated on the basis of that characterization. So some sophisticated software goes and checks what kind of file I've uploaded, and then triggers a range of behavior in response to that. So for a PDF, we generate a thumbnail and put it here. For an Office document, likewise, we have a requirement, but not an implementation yet for OCR. So for files that should get OCR'd, they would get OCR'd. And for images, we'd create derivatives and drop them in AAAF and do a viewer for them. So all of those are features that we expect to be sort of like set them up, knock them down to some extent. But there's part of the approach that we've taken is to really focus in on one thing at a time and make sure that we have things that we have the individual details sort of figured out one step at a time. So even where we're already seeing functions work, like this search, this is effectively an admin search, and you'd see Gabriella, I think, also thumbnails here if we had them. We're addressing those step by step. So there's tickets in the backlog, and I'll be doing, I think, a series of demos like this just for Gabriella to do acceptance on some of those tickets or scope out additional work for them.
Looks great.
So that was a very long answer to your simple question about thumbnails. I hope it was useful.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, look, and it says it's Comet v3.0. We should probably change our version. Okay. Gabriella, do you have any like ringer questions that you want to throw out there on behalf of the viewers? Should we call that recorded demo and break to talk about next? Oh, well, maybe I should talk about next steps. Is that a good idea?
I think so.
Okay.
Great.
So yeah, so we're starting sprint 2 this morning. Our goals are I think a little bit less well defined at this point for sprint 2. We've talked about wanting to be able to set very specific and clear goals. But I think we've done less well at that round 2 than round 1 so far. So maybe we'll want to resolve that a little bit today. What I'll say now is that the most important thing to us for sprint 2 is to get the staging and production sites in place. So I expect that to fall very quickly. This instance that we're seeing now is deployed onto UCSB's production infrastructure. And I started that deploy as Gabriella and I joined this call. So in wide contrast to an experience yesterday where we couldn't deploy at all and had to bump the meeting, this one, it was like in our sleep kind of situation. And that's really an important part of the way that we operate as the Surfliner team is to extensively practice the things that are most critical. So the platform availability and being able to roll out updates, we want to be really, really routine. So this is a demo app. We're deploying multiple demo apps a day. And it's really just getting the production configuration ironed out that will make the prod site come together. So I think that those will be quick ones. I'm actually sort of hoping that the staging sites on both campuses will be up today. So there'll be a stable place for us to point folks to where they can click around. The definition of stable may be pretty loose on day 1, but even just a week or two out, I might expect that to be like, okay, this site has SSO and you can click around, and you should expect it to sort of treat your staging content just as well as the production site eventually will. So that's a goal, is to get those staging and production sites in place. The object storage portion is something that I'm working on today, and actually we got some work merged into the Hyrax platform this morning related to that. So that's a big goal. I hope that at the end of this current sprint, we'll see things like object download, those thumbnail generation, that thumbnail generation work happening. And then the other piece that I think is a clear sprint goal is to get identifier minting working. So both campuses intend to use ARCs for permanent identifiers for objects. We have a little bit of a discussion, I think, to have about what the various object deposit workflows look like and at what points in them ARC minting happens. You can see that this is generic object number 6. And so there's some identifier conversations that we have to happen. But I think we want to see the basic outline of the identifier minting happening this sprint as well. So I guess at the risk of sort of having unilaterally set the sprint goals without the buy-in of my team, I'll recap at staging and production deploys, object deposit and file download, and object by object deposit I mean long-term file storage, repository file storage, and the ARC minting. With a little luck, I think we'll make some progress on access controls, and maybe I'll show you something that's marked public next time. Yeah, it's not quite as critical path, I think, the access controls, because right now the scope of this platform is really 2 logged in UC library users. So staff, for lack of a better word. So the ACLs will be important when it comes to pushing this content out to public platforms, where what we want is for Comet to be the place where the canonical rules about who can see what and policy are all controlled. But what exactly happens to objects in Comet in terms of how access controls operate it's not as critical, because the only people who should be accessing this site are the ones who are staff. And so that's again a lot that I've said about what we're up to next.
Real quick, Tom.
Yeah.
For the viewers, you've mentioned ACLs twice, and I'm not sure everybody knows.
Oh yeah. Thank you. I appreciate the gatekeeping. ACLs is access control lists, which maybe isn't a deep clarification, but the model for how to determine who can do what with a repository object. So that's objects and files and collections, who can read them, who can edit them, less so like what actions they can take in the Comet platform, but the specific, like, can the public read this file? Can the public download this file? Can the public see it in a search discovery interface? And likewise for individual users. So if you'd like to grant read access to a like named user, either internal or external, the way that we control that is through an access control list. So each object has data set attached to it that says basically mode being like read, edit, discover. I think those are the actual modes that we have now. And then a user or a group. And the users are identified by default by email. We may or may not keep that. And groups are sort of more complicated and resolved at this point just by Comet itself. But the idea is that those data sets containing those access control lists, each of those statements determines what permissions users across multiple platforms have for objects in terms of those basic kinds of actions. Do you have questions about that to clarify, Gabriella? I hope that was a like right level kind of explanation.
I think it was perfect.
Great.
And, because I know you're going to mention it, continue to do so as we move along with development, but I just want the users or our listeners to know what ACLs are.
Yeah. Defining terms is a good thing to do. Please continue to catch me on that as we do more of these kinds of public demos.
Great. So I think for this Sprint 1 demo, I think that pretty much wraps it up.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks to everyone who stuck with us through the whole recording.
Thanks, Tom, for your time. I'm going to stop recording now.
Sure thing.